Hi, Jeremy Cardell in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycardell.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
A room without books is like a body without a soul.
Hi, and welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for addicted readers who aren't seeking treatment. I'm Kath Keneally.
And I'm Sarah Martin. We've got some treats for you today, sure to inspire some additions to your Sundoku. Michaela brings us a classic from 1979, a collection of subverted fairy tales titled The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. A groundbreaking book at the time, which still packs a very big punch.
And the wisdom of the ancient philosophers is making quite a big comeback these days. Can they help answer the big questions of how to live a good life? Annie speaks with an author who's taken on some of these conundrums.
If you've been wondering how to deal with all the dilemmas that modern life, wars, COVID and the lack of old religious certainties throw at us, we may have found a book for you. Journalist Brigid Delaney found her moral compass in the writings of Roman philosophers of the Stoic school. And if you think Stoicism is just about putting up with stuff and not complaining, well, there's much more to it than that. Brigid Delaney was at Adelaide Writers' Week to talk about her book, Reasons Not to Worry, How to be Stoic in Chaotic Times. And Sundoku's Annie Haswell caught up with her there.
Stoicism, let's go back to where it all began. What was going on in ancient Rome that made people turn to a philosophy like this?
Well, in ancient Rome, it was quite embedded in the kind of education system and in the culture. But when it started in Greece in 350 BC, that was the really exciting time for philosophy. There were different schools that were operating around Athens. So Epicureanism, Cynicism and Stoicism. And the Stoics got their name from the Stoa, which is the painted porch where they used to meet to discuss philosophy.
So it's a bit like the front porch movement where people actually get together and see the world go by as well.
Exactly. So it was quite democratic. Like you could come and go from lectures. You didn't need to have money. Men or women were welcome, as in ancient Greece, slaves or free people. It was a philosophy that welcomed all, as long as you had a rational mind and could, accept debate and challenge and knowledge. So, yeah.
Let's go to the basics of Stoicism before we talk about what attracted you to it. Take me through what the basic principles are.
So the main principle that I first learnt was this thing called the control test. And it's got three elements, which is like the Stoics believed you couldn't control anything in life except for these three things. That is your character, your actions and reactions, and how you treat other people. All else is outside your control, so you shouldn't worry about it, which is how my book got its name. Some things are within your partial control. So if you look at something like health, you can make certain decisions that will enable you to live a healthier life, but you could still get hit by a car. You could still be struck down by a disease. You could be bitten by a malaria infested insect. All sorts of things are outside your control, and Stoicism is a lot about accepting the boundaries of control.
So one of the things that you do as a Stoic is you imagine the worst, or you imagine your own death, you imagine the death of your children, of those that you love, which seems to me a pretty tough thing to do without becoming quite depressed. How does that work to sort of make you live a more peaceful life, which is what Stoicism's heading towards?
Yeah, I mean, on face value, that sounds like a kind of contradiction, that in order to live joyfully and happily, you have to imagine terrible things happening to the people you love the most. But the Stoics' view is that we have to be constantly aware of our mortality and the mortality of those around us, so that we can fully enjoy our lives and fully enjoy the company of others. If we take people for granted, if we don't use the time that we've got, very soon we find that it can run out, and there's a second suffering. The suffering is that the first suffering is maybe someone's died that's close to you, but the second is maybe realizing that you didn't enjoy that person or spend time with that person while they were alive, and that you took for granted that they would be there forever. So the Stoics realized you couldn't control the first suffering, which might be the death of a loved one, but you could control the second suffering, which is the guilt and regrets that you might have later on.
And you apply that to much more banal situations, like just when you have a fight with someone, or you might get demoted, some little thing that happens to you in life. Can you explain how you put the same principles to work there?
So an example might be like a flight. Your flight's delayed and you have to spend 4 hours waiting at the airport, and you might miss a meeting. So by applying the control test, you look at, can I control if this flight's delayed? No, I can't control it. So I can't therefore control if I miss this meeting. So I shouldn't stress. When it comes to friendship, so say you have a fight with a friend, I mean, that can be really unpleasant and can kind of stick around in your psyche for a while as, a sort of really upsetting problem. But you should look at your conduct in the fight, because you can't control your friend's reaction. If you've had a dispute with someone, you can only control how you have responded. So if your character has been good throughout that interaction with a friend, then you can't really control, their response. So you shouldn't necessarily stay up worrying about it.
In your book, you keep meeting and re-meeting your friend and discussing situations where Stoicism might work and might not work, and you put things through the control test. Can you explain a couple of the examples of things that you apply the control test to?
Yeah, definitely. So one of which, I think in that time I was unsuccessful for a pay rise, and that can be upsetting if you need more money and you think you're doing a good job at work and you don't get that pay rise. And he quite rightly pointed out that under Stoicism, you don't have control over whether you're paid more. You only have control over doing the best job in your employment as you can possibly do. With a pay rise, it's dependent on all sorts of factors that are outside your control, including the economy, how much money in the budget the company has, whether or not there are any pay rises going that year, whether or not they've needed to use that money to retain someone else or employ someone else. So if you stake your happiness on getting a pay rise, then you're putting your happiness out onto something that you can't control, and that's always a bit of a dicey concept in Stoicism.
The only thing that struck me, I loved a lot of the messages in this book and in the messages in Stoicism, but there's a part where you explain someone getting incredibly excited about something, and Stoicism doesn't lend itself to extremes of emotion, and I have this vision of all these sort of stiff upper lip people and never getting too excited about things. Is that an unfair reading to take from it? Can we still be happy and sad?
I mean, definitely. The Stoics were people that experienced all sorts of emotions, but the one kind of state that they prized the most was this, it's a Greek word, ataraxia, which is equilibrium. So they absolutely felt the sort of highs and lows of life and the griefs and the joys, but they strove to kind of keep themselves on an even plane, because say, for example, you get really happy that you've won a big contract at work that's going to bring a lot of money into your company. So you're extremely overjoyed. And then you might find out the next day that the company's changed their mind or the contract's gone to someone else. And then you have the corresponding crash, you go into deep despair. And I think that's quite a normal thing we do. We tend to have corresponding highs and lows purely because of homeostasis, where if we're going to get really overjoyed about something and then something bad happens, there will be a kind of a similar sort of trough to the high. And the Stoics were amazing they were amazingly canny about human nature, and they realized that the lows can be so bad that it's probably better to sacrifice some of the highs and just be in that middle ground, because fortune can change so rapidly. So you don't want to be a hostage to circumstances outside your control. So if you have that baseline tranquility, you're less likely to be rocked in a significant way when things do go badly. So it was a bit of an insurance policy, and I've kind of become a lot more stoic since doing the book, but I do miss the feeling of those big highs.
And how does it fit with the superstition that was so much part of cultures back then? And I think deep down is in us, I'm going to have a good day, I'm going to have a bad day. This is great, but things will go bad now. The kind of feeling that we have that there's some kind of weird balance in the universe that is controlling us.
I mean, that's super interesting because the Stoics prized rational thoughts, so they were a very rational bunch. They weren't necessarily superstitious at all. They were really into studying human nature. So it was more like, how are other people going to act and react in your society and your community, rather than what are some mysterious forces in the universe going to do. They also believed in fate to an extent. You hear a lot of writings about fate in Stoicism. So they believed that you should accept the fate to which you're given and the people that fate has surrounded you with. So there's a lot of acceptance of what fate has brought to you, which I find quite comforting.
Now, we're at Writers' Week and you were signing books this morning and no doubt having discussions with people, and we live in a society where depression and anxiety seem to be absolutely rife. What is it about now that, what kind of feeling did you get from people you spoke to about what Stoicism can do for them?
I mean, amazing, in the lineup queue, a lot of people were saying to me, oh, this is amazing. I didn't know about Stoicism. I've heard your talk and I realize I am actually Stoic. So for a lot of people, it's confirmed that their worldview on how they get through life actually has this deep basis, many thousands of years old, that's been enshrined in a philosophy. And so it was, I think a lot of people felt quite comforted to know that Stoicism exists. These very smart people a long time ago formulated a cradle-to-grave system that is, I mean, it's almost like picking something up off the shelf and it's still in perfect working order. Like it's an extraordinary philosophy that is particularly useful to our times, because it's about looking life in the eye and seeing it for what it is and being realistic.
What about for you? Do you remember the first moment you discovered it, and why you were drawn towards it?
I was doing a column on it and I wasn't drawn towards it so much as I was just like, oh, I've got to write about something this week. This seems to be in the zeitgeist. And it took a long time for me to get drawn into it. I think it can be a bit, I came to it obviously as a woman, which can be a bit of, and also not academic. So as a non-academic woman, I didn't see a lot of entry points in Stoicism, and I had to really kind of carve them out myself. There's not a lot of female authors in this space, definitely not really any popular authors that I've come across that are women. So yeah, it wasn't a natural fit. I had to really work hard to find my way in.
It's got a bit of a hero feel about it, hasn't it? The fact that you are if what you can't control, you don't do anything about it, but that you remain a good person. Do you think that's why it may have been more of a male thing?
I'm not sure why it's a male thing. I think it's because men have started writing about it, and men often on podcasts and other things speak to other men, then that's just become a self-perpetuating thing. But there was nothing in the philosophy that seemed inherently male to me. It felt very much like it could be for men or women. It didn't seem particularly gender specific. Yeah.
Do you think it has lessons for women in these times?
I mean, definitely. It's got lessons around. I mean, it's lessons for men and women, but I think there's some teachings around emotion which I don't think take into account hormones, menstrual cycles, all that sort of stuff, where women's emotional journey over the month is going to depend on her cycle. Like, that is not in Stoicism, in ancient Greek and Roman Stoicism, but it does impact moods and it does impact reactions and emotions. So I think women have to take that into account when they read Stoicism, that a lot of it was written at a time when we didn't quite understand biology, neurology, psychology, but there's still a lot about human nature in there that is useful.
But a good Stoic would overcome those moments when you want to throw something at the wall or kick the furniture.
Yes, ideally, yes. A good Stoic would overcome that or just pause. But also, I think we can't beat ourselves up for failing to control every single emotion that passes through us, because some of it is, very much related to biology.
So you've structured the book to run through various emotions and times that people experience in their lives, and death is looms quite large, and accepting death. Can you just talk a little bit around grief and death, and as a Stoic, how one deals with it?
This is such a big part of Stoicism. Seneca said, we're dying every day. So they always had death at the forefront of their minds. A lot of death came swiftly, unexpectedly, plagues, illness. Women and their children died in childbirth. It was, a time of high infant mortality. So they needed to have a philosophy that incorporated an acceptance of death. Otherwise, they would have gone mad. That was just thinking every day that you're going to die, people you love are going to die, and not taking the present moment for granted.
So for you, give me a little bit of a picture of you before Stoicism and you after. How has it changed you?
It's definitely made me feel more, more tranquil, more accepting, less stressed. I worry less about what people think now.
Actually, on that topic, can you just tell the story about the puffer jacket? Because part of Stoicism that we haven't mentioned is this idea that you put yourself through certain situations that you would hate, like being embarrassed or not eating enough or things like that.
My brother bought me an enormous, I think as a joke, an enormous puffer jacket that was made for Arctic explorers, and he said you can't wear that anywhere. It's so ridiculous. People will laugh at it. But a lot of the ancient Stoics used to wear ridiculous clothing as a way of inoculating themselves from shame, because they said there's nothing inherently shameful about wearing stupid clothing. It's just a societal thing. So, so I had this enormous jacket that I wore out that, I just have to sort of turn up somewhere in it and people would fall on the ground laughing. It was, I looked like George Costanza in an episode of Seinfeld, the Gore-Tex one, and I took it to Turkey and dogs kind of humped me. It was just a very... it was an hysterical jacket, but it does have, it is part of a Stoic exercise to wear it.
And is that something that's endured in the post-Stoic you, that sort of thing?
I don't know if I'm post-Stoic. I think I'm still on the journey. I haven't worn the jacket in a while, but I still, I still think I will probably do Stoic practices from time to time.
Brigid Delaney speaking with Annie Haswell at Adelaide Writers' Week about her book, Reasons Not to Worry, How to Be Stoic in Chaotic Times.
The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter is a collection of fairy tales, not for little children nor for the faint-hearted. The first story in the collection gives the book its title, The Bloody Chamber, and it's a reinvention of the classical story of Bluebeard, the horrid protagonist in the French fairy tale of 1895, who murdered a succession of wives. There's also a retake on Puss in Boots, Beauty and the Beast, Red Riding Hood, and so on. Michaela read them for pure pleasure and then invited our beloved regular guests, Associate Professors Lisa Bennett and Kylie Cardell from Flinders University, to bring some analysis to discussion, starting by asking Kylie what unites these wild and wonderfully macabre stories.
Oh, goodness. Well, the uniting themes are fairy tales, a love of fairy tale and a passion for the kinds of ways in which they explore the adventures of our lives. And the critical thing that Carter does, of course, is she centres the female characters in all of her fairy tales. And that is not a huge twist, because a lot of fairy tales have central female characters, but she kind of gives them a little passion. She gives them a bit more agency, maybe, a bit more power than female characters tend to have in fairy tales. So the theme is female empowerment and female kind of lives and how you survive in the bloody world and all the terrors that it can hold for women and girls in particular.
And what about a theme of metamorphosis and change. Did you see?
Sure. Absolutely. Growth, coming to terms with when you overcome something, what do you learn about yourself and how do you grow as a person? These are also classic themes in historical fairy tales. The characters change in ways that I think would resonate to the readers of her time, which is the 1970s, but still to us now. How do you kind of overcome your origins, or how are you changed by big life events, and who are you after those moments?
Because the book was written in 1979, which and, when I was reading, I couldn't really place quite when it had been written. It is absolutely timeless. You wouldn't know. And I've read somewhere that she says that she wasn't creating adult versions of traditional fairy tales, but she says she was extracting the latent content from the traditional stories. Lisa, what do you think some of that latent content is?
Well, I'm going to just riff off something Kylie was saying, and she is really inverting a lot of those kind of female roles and making them the focus and have a lot of power in the stories, like Kylie was saying. But I think latently in there's a lot of material that is about coming of age, about, horrible abuse and things like that don't really get drawn out in traditional fairy tale modes, because they're, intended to have morals and give lessons of proper behavior. And so she's questioning what is proper behavior. The patriarchy gets smashed in these stories in a way that I know that all of my young students, male or female, are going, whoa, mind blown. I have never seen a fairy tale do this, because they're used to Disney, they're used to the fairy tales that have been sanitized a little bit. So I think that what Angela Carter is doing is going back to how the fairy tales were in the Grimm's originals, in the kind of 18th century originals, the 17th century, where there are iron shoes that burn feet and, people get tortured, and it's awful. I felt deeply uncomfortable rereading a lot of these stories, even though I have read them many times and I love them. You go, people are horrible. And not just the women. Hooray!
There's also themes of sex and love, of course.
There's
physical
some raunchy
passion.
stuff in there.
It's pretty erotic. And that might be why people think they're adult fairy tales, but they're not. They're about adult themes to some degree, but they're also about transitions and thresholds and what happens to the girl, once she becomes married, is she's ostensibly supposed to lose her virginity and she's supposed to turn from maiden to mother, and all these kinds of moments in a woman's life that are skated over in fairy tales, but they're also about that. All of fairy tale characters are finding themselves in a new circumstance and trying to figure out how to live, how to survive. And one of those key moments for women in history is always menstruation, marriage, and childbirth. And this is a real theme throughout this book as well.
Yeah, what happens in the Bloody Chamber, in that collection of stories, is no worse than anything that happens in any other fairy tale. It's just a little more grittily told.
She's making it blatant instead of implicit. So, I was reading Thumbelina with my daughter from an old 1980s kind of golden book sort of thing. And they just blithely are shipping Thumbelina off to try to get married to various gross creatures, including a toad. And so on the surface you go, oh, here's a beautiful little fairy that's going to marry a frog. But if you look at it as an adult, you think, here is a young girl being married off against her will to a horny toad. What does that mean? And so I think this is what Angela Carter is picking up on and going, well, it's already there. Now I'm just going to actually make it explicit in some of these stories and give the girl a bit of power in getting herself out of that situation. Or, like we see with the Bloody Chamber, having her mother step in instead of the huntsman or some sort of heroic knight coming in to save her. It's the women helping each other out. And that's, again, something that nobody had really seen before Angela Carter started doing this with fairy tales. And now loads of people do it, so it seems familiar. But I feel like she's the one that really got that ball rolling.
And what is an absolute standout for me in reading the book is her approach. First of all, it's dark, it's gothic, which I know you love gothic literature. I never quite know when these things are taking place. Just every now and then you will find out that a telephone rings and you think, oh, must be early 1900s or something. They could be happening anywhere. They're just so dark, so gothic, so lavish and so voluptuous. The language is stunning. And she just paints so many incredible images. If we go to the Bloody Chamber, there's a scene where she loses her virginity to her new husband. The room is full of mirrors and calla lilies, and she talks about them being flowers with their stamens dipped in turmeric, and the lilies that are white but stain you. You know, really menacing language. I mean, has anyone been as good since?
Oh, I think people try. I don't know. I think that her language is impeccable. It is dense. And a friend of mine who is also a writer uses the term, not for Angela Carter, but for her own writing, muscular velocity. And I think that that's what this writing shows. It's thick, but still active. So it's not purple. It's not purple prose where you're just blindly, butting up against horrible metaphors and lots of frilly language. But it is something that you have to luxuriate in and read slowly. You can't just whip through these stories.
I mean, I was saying to you, Lisa, I couldn't resist in the privacy of my own home, reading one aloud and just relishing and enjoying the beauty of the language, the pleasure of the imagery she's creating. And it is poetic and it is rich. And there's a pleasure given to the reader of coaxing you towards interpretations that you think, oh, why are the pistons of the engine thrusting so hard? And you're like, that sounds, am I being, oh yeah, that's exactly what she's trying to make you think. This whole story is about the young girl moving towards marriage and sexuality. And yes, that is the theme. But the language is kind of, sort of toying with you and giving you a pleasure. It's really, really fascinating.
I think with all short stories, the language is super important because, there's not as much of it. There's no room for filler or flab. You have to be precise with your word choice. But I think that Angela Carter has done this in a masterful way. Every word, every metaphor, every simile, every image or detail, of which there are many, nothing is there just for filler, or it's all there if you reread the story to go, of course that's what that image is suggesting, or of course they have this particular kind of fragile porcelain thing in the room because that represents, her feelings or her womanhood or whatever. She's so careful with including tons of specific detail.
Oh, but many details, like when the protagonist of Bloody Chamber goes to the library and there's like, the key to mysteries and all these kind of books, and she's like, oh, nothing for a young virgin here. And it's like, no, those are the books about women being, trapped. And, and so it's very funny as well. There's a lot of jokes.
Well, I was going to say the same thing. The humour, Puss in Boots is very funny. I mean, there's a line where Puss says, French, it's the only language in which you can purr.
Love, love, love. It is a hilarious story, macabre and dark and quite grim. In fact, there's some very disturbing kinds of engagements that happen and murders, but it's very, very funny.
Just following on from what you said about reading it aloud, for a treat for myself, after reading it, then I listened to the audio version of The Bloody Chamber, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. The actors are incredible. A female and a male sort of alternate in telling the stories. But what's the standout for you? What story stands out for you, and in what ways?
I always think of The Werewolf first because it's about a page and a half long and manages to completely invert the Red Riding Hood story and give Red Riding Hood such vicious power. The language is amazing. It's still dense, but obviously the whole story is quite short. So she chooses the most powerful, specific, even short words to evoke this grim, dark, foresty fairy tale world, so that you really get a sense of who these people are and how they will lead to the horrible conclusion. A page and a half late, it just blows my mind how she manages to create the whole world, motivations, backstories, the villages, all their perspective, and then, the wolf is also different. It's just, I love this story so much. And I'm trying to be a little bit circumspect here in case anyone hasn't read it. I want them to feel it for the first time. But, oh my gosh, that one is the standout for me forever.
And what about you,
I'm
Kylie?
less decisive than Lisa, as usual. I think for me it's The Bloody Chamber because the richness of the interpretation that story gives, you know, the layers of mythology and art history. And then, of course, I think it really embodies Carter's feminist principles really strongly. And she has written critical literary interpretations that promote her ideas about the erotic as a kind of necessary rebellion for women. And so she's got very strong ideas on why it's important for women to have an erotic life. And I think that there's so many amazing kinds of images there for the kind of feminism that Carter's working with in her time, which is about women's rights and the right to sort of have your own kind of life and choose your identities in ways that the culture of the 1970s and the 80s is pushing back on. So The Bloody Chamber for me, I also love The Company of Wolves, which is another Red Riding Hood retelling. And again, Carter is very faithful to the plot. It's a very familiar story. The shape of that fairy tale really matches the original, but there's some very interesting twists and inversions, and the ending to me is particularly satisfying. And again, like Lisa, I'll let the readers find that out, because it is a real pleasure to see where she takes this story and what happens to the young girl in Red Riding Hood in that story particularly.
Yeah, I think I was the same as you, Kylie. The Bloody Chamber really took my breath away. I was scared. I was on the edge of my seat. It was so dark. But I think one of my favourites probably was The Tiger's Bride, because in first reading it, I just didn't quite know what was happening. I didn't know if this was a dream sequence. I just couldn't. It was such as the magical realism, I suppose, that I don't know if that's how you describe it. And it wasn't till it was finished that I thought, oh, now I have to read that again to understand again what I just witnessed.
I think that with all of her stories, they leave you with that effect. You read it the first time and you're in this strange fever dream of her language, the grimness, the forever timeliness of it. And then you get to the end and you go, okay, well, that was a Beauty and the Beast story. Gotcha. But also, oh my gosh, all of the clues that you gave that I didn't get the first time around. Now I need to start over again so I can start to notice how smart you are and how you've laid all of these breadcrumbs for us, another fairy tale reference, to follow through.
Well, isn't that the case? Fairy tales have been entertaining, you know, children and adults for generations. They've been read over and over again. And like all good fairy tales, Angela Carter's work is timeless.
Absolutely. And also has changed original fairy tales for me forever. We've spoken before about retellings and how they have altered the original source. And I feel like now, anytime I read a fairy tale, if I'm reading fairy tales to my 4-year-old daughter, I go, okay, we'll read the story as it is, and then we need to talk. You know, because I just can't help but think of things through Angela Carter's kind of viewpoint now and go, this is terrible. Look at this poor girl. Look at this poor woman. This is an awful situation. I don't want you to think that's the way things should be.
Yeah, and I love how intentional she is about that. Like, that is her. She is being political in these fairy stories. So there are lessons here. You're not getting beat over the head with them, and you're not being asked to sit down and listen quietly. But there are lessons here that she's very, very sure she wants you to get. When she wrote this book, she'd been busy translating Perrault's fairy tales from French into English, so she knows the source material intimately. And what she's obviously found is a lack of attention to the kinds of experiences that she's had as a woman in society. And so she's like, hey, the fairy tale is a way in which people in the past have made sense of the things they need to figure out to be good people and to survive. And that's what the fairy tale purpose is. It's like psychological development, the transition from child to adult. But where, you know, what are the stories we've been telling to the girls? And she's very, very deliberate about changing not the shape of the story, but the power that women have in relation to the stories of their lives.
So what I'm gathering is that her work is voluptuous, it's gothic, it's subversive, but it's also very learned.
Absolutely. And without the kind of moralistic heavy-handedness where you read some fairy tales and you think, okay, gotcha, this is how we're meant to behave, don't go into the woods, blah blah. But with hers, it's entertaining and unsettling, and you feel like your world view has changed once you finish reading her stories and go, oh, I didn't realize that was just sort of internalized. And so that's why I think I love introducing it to students every year, because it's still mind-blowing and you feel, wow, I think of things in a different way now. And that's what really good literature should do. And that she does it so many times in so many stories, I just find incredible.
So it's a classic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's one of my favourite books right up there for me. Every time I read it, there's something new to gain, whether it's extending my vocabulary, because Carter has a grasp of language and reference that I think is very special. So it's an incredibly rich book to read. And because fairy tales are so much a part of our culture in Western societies, there's a lot for us to gain about taking a different angle on these stories. And Carter offers up such a beautiful and powerful way of doing that. And then, as Lisa says, there's been sort of endless kinds of evolutions of that to now. But she's really the one that kicks it off.
I think you can pick up on everyone's enthusiasm for the collection of short fairy tales entitled The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, and all I can say is read it, or get the astonishingly good audio version for free from BorrowBox.
Time for us to go. Thanks for joining us today, and we've got more in the works, so stay tuned for the next episode of Sundoku. I'm Sarah Martin.
And I'm Kath Keneally. Happy reading. Talk soon.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally.
Michaela Andreev.
Annie Hastwell.
And me, Sarah Martin. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Sundokukast, TSUNDOKU cast.
Hi, Jeremy Cardell in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordell.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.